Well, why don't we see if we can get started. Before I introduce the speaker, just a caveat. At 5 o'clock, quite a few people will have to take off. We're anointing some colleagues or getting some endowed chair appointed. So at 5 o'clock, we'll take a 10-second break and we'll let some people leave who have to go at that point. The talk will go from basically 4 till about 5:30. And we'll have an official end to the talk, but Professor Kuran has been so generous to stay on after that, so we can still have an informal one-on-one after 5:30, even though the formal end, if you will come at 5:30. All right. I think many of us will know Professor Kuran's work. He is truly a Renaissance man who covers at least 3 fields. I know him as a political scientist for some of his path-breaking work and his publications of world politics, among others. But he's, of course, by training an economist. And he has the Gora Family Professorship in Islamic Studies at Duke University. He's the author of 4 books and at least 60 articles and essays. So, as all economists probably, he's extremely productive and putting out many articles and essays. So it's truly a pleasure to have Timur Kuran in our midst, and please join me in welcoming him to the Senate.
Thank you for the generous introduction, and thanks also to all of you for the opportunity to share ideas that have been central to my research for quite a few years. I'm going to essentially present the core argument in a book that just came out, The Long Divergence, How Islamic Law Held Back the Middle East. But I am going to take some tangents to point out implications for political development. Many of you here have written published books and articles, and you know that in writing, especially on a big topic, you have to make certain choices. There are certain things that you leave out for reasons of length. There's certain things that you leave out because you intend to, you set them aside to deal with them later. So there are some political implications of the economic arguments that I'm going to make, which I will touch on as the argument develops. So the Middle East has had a poor economic record over the past 2 centuries, and you can see this in these statistics. The region's per capita income is less than 1/3 of the per capita income in advanced industrial countries. Life expectancy is about 8 years less. Within the Middle East, there are variations, of course. Turkey is the most advanced in almost all of these indices. But all of its components stand out as poor performers. I'm defining the Middle East, by the way, as all parts of West Asia and North Africa, where Islamic law was the law of the land until the 19th century, in some cases, of course, into the 20th century and 21st. So that includes the Middle East. Under this definition, includes Turkey and the Balkans. This underperformance is a puzzle because in the Middle Ages, the region was not a laggard by the standards of the day. Only China might have been richer. Evidence can be seen in old bazaars of the region. Here's a street in what was once the world's largest shopping mall. Travelers marveled at the variety of goods traded in Istanbul's covered bazaar and the volume of commerce in it. This is what the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul looked like around the 17th century. Scenes like this impressed foreigners. Something must have happened that kept the Middle East from remaining advanced economically and from becoming a laggard. Something must have kept it from generating the transformations that made Europe get ahead. With political indicators, there's a parallel contrast. According to virtually all international comparative political indices, the Middle East performs quite poorly, again with some variations across countries, the Arab League, Iran, and Turkey, as you see on the screen. But there's a huge gap between Europe and the Middle East. If you go back half a millennium, of course, there's no democracy anywhere. At the very least, one can say that there's no sharp contrast in political indicators. The political contrast has grown over time. Now, I'm going to suggest an explanation for the reversal of the Middle East's economic fortunes, with some insights, as I said, into the political patterns as well. Of course, I'm not the first to speak on these subjects. Most existing explanations of economic underdevelopment center on misguided state policies, bad state priorities, lack of vision on the part of statesmen, regulations that kept the private sector from developing. It has been convenient to focus on the state as a source of the problems of the Middle East for a simple reason. Public archives in the Middle East are rich and private archives are almost non-existent. Research driven by convenience of data will distort conclusions in any context, but the distortion has been particularly serious in this context, in Middle Eastern history, and more serious than with respect to European history, because historically Middle Eastern states were shallow states. They provided law and order, they collected taxes, and they didn't do much else. Public services were provided privately through trusts called waqfs or vakufs, depending on the Middle Eastern language. They were not provided by local governments as in Europe. An alternative starting point, which is the one that I'm going to take, is the trajectory of the private sector. The private sector essentially stagnated during the second millennium. Its institutions remained more or less fixed. So let's start by asking what we know about the timing of the region's slip into underdevelopment. The 18th and 19th centuries were a time of crisis in the Middle East. Massive reforms were undertaken to jumpstart an economic catch-up process. It's not controversial at all that by then the Middle East was poor. This perception was shared by peoples of the region, including local leaders. Did the region fall behind all of a sudden? Some analysts have gone back a few centuries to the era when Mamluk Egypt and then the Ottoman Empire gave one-sided trading privileges to Europeans. But if we ask why these trading privileges were given, these trading privileges called capitulations, and we look at the content of the capitulations, we see that they were meant to get around inconvenient institutional features of the region, in other words, the Middle East. To unlock why institutional handicaps existed by the 15th and 16th centuries, we need to go further back to the 9th and 10th centuries, which is when the institutional framework for commerce and finance in the region fell into place. Distinct institutions emerged by then for pooling resources. This is essential for commerce. You need to pool labor and capital somehow. And secondly, for providing public goods such as schools and water fountains. These two institutions, which I'm going to identify and say a lot about, were all components of the Sharia or Islamic law, which was the law of the land in the Middle East. In the pre-modern Middle East, not every aspect of daily life was governed by Islamic law, but critical aspects of the economy, as I'm going to identify, were governed by Islamic law, and that made a huge difference to the region's economic trajectory. So that is the theme of the book that has just been issued. I suggest in the book that the roots of underdevelopment go back to the Middle Ages. The capitulations were not causes of underdevelopment, as some historians have held. They were among the early symptoms, and that's how they are treated in the book. So let's go back to the period when the Middle East started looking obviously poor, uncontroversially poor, and when the region's leaders launched reforms. This period coincides with the Industrial Revolution. The new industries of the period involved mass production using new technologies. These technologies emerged in Western Europe. That part of the story is quite well known, and Joel Mokir has written among the classic contributions in the area. Also critical, however, is that Western Europe took the lead in developing institutions that enable the exploitation of the technologies of mass production. By the late 18th century, through stock markets and banks and corporations, Western Europe was mobilizing the savings of large numbers and channeling them into mass production. Entrepreneurs in Europe were pooling the labor and capital of very large numbers within indefinitely living companies. Now we take these capabilities for granted, but they posed immense organizational challenges in some parts of the world, China and India and certainly the Middle East. The new physical technologies were easily transferable. You can carry a steam engine on a ship. If you don't know how to operate it, you can bring in a technician with it. The institutions that enabled the West to exploit the new physical technologies, these were not so easily transferable. You can't set up a stock market overnight. This requires an intricate legal system and various professions to support it. As growth took off in the West, the Middle East could import the technologies of industrialization, but it lacked the organizational capabilities to use them, and these could not be borrowed at will or quickly. That organizational limitations posed a huge handicap was noticed by Middle Eastern leaders in the mid-19th century. In the Ottoman Empire, an early response was the founding of the first completely indigenous modern company, modern in the sense that it would have an indefinite existence and have publicly traded shares. This was the Şirket-i Hayriye Marine Transportation Company. This company was a profit-seeking enterprise, but it was not set up merely to make money. It was intended to serve as the prototype of a completely new type of company with respect to the traditional legal system of the Ottoman Empire. This company, Şirket-i Hayriye, issued 1,500 tradable shares initially. More were added to them later, and most of these were bought by dignitaries, more or less under the direction of the Sultan. Now, why did the Sultan get involved? By the 1850s, the most dynamic sectors of the Ottoman economy were dominated by permanent and large enterprises, and these were all owned by foreigners or minorities. Sultan Abdülmecit felt that it was time for Muslim Turks to begin pooling capital within large and durable companies capable of exploiting modern technologies. The political leadership was to set an example for the rest of society to follow. That's why it was so important that dignitaries buy shares. They were to set an example. Evidently, Ottoman elites were coming to grips with the limitations of traditional economic institutions grounded in Islamic law. They recognized by that time that the traditional means of pooling capital and labor in the region were ill-suited to forming the sort of enterprise that prevailed in new sectors such as banking, mass transport, and manufacturing. What were the traditional means for pooling capital and labor? They were simple partnerships that were formed under Islamic law, partnerships that had not changed form in 1,000 years. I will say more about them in a moment. In modern sectors such as mass manufacturing and mass transportation, successful enterprises did not consist of partnerships. It was not possible to compete in the new sectors, emerging sectors, through Islamic partnerships that had not changed form in 1,000 years. Why did Abdülmecit single out Muslim Turks for help? Of course, it was an age of spreading nationalism. That explains perhaps the Turkish part. The general problem is that the Ottoman Empire's Muslims were having trouble competing through traditional institutions, not only with foreigners, but also with local minorities. Local Greeks, local Armenians, local Jews. These religious minorities were forming commercial alliances with Europeans and benefiting from new European institutions. Why were minorities transforming their business techniques and not Muslims? Under Islamic law, minorities enjoyed choice of law, which is the right to do business under rules of one's own choice. Islam, going way back to the early decades of Islam, denied Muslims that right. To be a Muslim was to live under Islamic law. So this is why it was much more difficult for Muslims to transform the way they did business and start using new organizational forms than it was for minorities. I'm not going to have time in this talk for the details, but I can certainly get into it during the Q&A period, and of course there's a great deal in the book. Let me relate the leap that Sultan Abdülmecid tried to make to the three basic organizational forms used in commercial life. In the 1850s, the organizational menu in the indigenous commerce of the Middle East was limited to various types of partnerships. These are enterprises that are established for specific purposes. Every member has veto power over decisions, and shares are not tradable. Abdülmecid tried to broaden the menu of options by establishing Şirket-i Hayriye as a joint stock company. Ownership was divided into shares. The shares were freely tradable, so Şirket-i Hayriye was to have a life independent of the lives of individual founders and employees. Most of the world's largest companies, even in the 1850s and certainly now, are corporations. Unlike a standard joint stock company, a corporation has standing in court. It can sue and be sued as an organization, and it cannot be dissolved through the will of a single member. Şirket-i Hayriye was not a corporation. It has one feature of a corporation, the fact that it has an indefinite life, but not all features. Incorporation under Ottoman law, establishing, which is in other words establishing a corporation, became possible only in 1908. That is when the first law of corporations was passed in the Ottoman Empire, and around the same time the first law of corporations was passed in Egypt. How successful was Abdülmecid's plan to trigger an explosion in large companies owned by Ottoman Muslims? In the short run, not at all. It took 60 years for Abdülmecid's initiative to bear fruit. Up until the early 20th century, as you can see on the bar graphs there, almost all new publicly traded companies were formed by foreigners and minorities. Does this have a pointer? Yes. No. Okay. So as you can see, in the 1850-1908 period, there are very few modern companies, joint stock companies, or corporations founded by Muslims. They're all of them are founded either by foreigners alone or by minorities alone, and generally through a combination through alliance. After 1908, the picture changes, and Muslims start founding many modern companies. Now, why did it take so long? Why did the Middle East not develop the corporation from within and have to transplant this institution from abroad in the early 20th century? In the 19th century, critical complementary institutions were still missing. A law of corporations, for that reason, would have been meaningless. To explain why, I have to take you way back to around the year 1000 and tell you about the legal system under which the private economy traditionally operated and still operated in the 1850s at the time of Abdülmecid's intervention. Then I'll explain why that legal system stagnated for a millennium. So in the Middle East, 1,000 years ago, commercial enterprises were formed under Islamic partnership law. The emergence of this law was a very important development. People could always do business using their own capital. They could form a proprietary business. To do business on a larger scale, they needed to pool resources with others within a partnership. They look first to the family because family members tend to trust each other. But not everyone has a family able to supply capital. So every civilization has faced the challenge of promoting trust among non-relatives who stand to gain by pooling labor and capital. Specifically, you have merchants and producers who need capital, and you have potential investors who don't want to do the physical work, like carrying goods to a distant land on a ship or by caravan. The challenge is to devise institutions that allow these demanders and suppliers of capital to pool their resources. Islam produced an impressive contract law for the period to regulate partnerships among these groups. The typical partnership was known as mudaraba. It combined the labor of a producer or traveling merchant with the capital of one or more passive investors. The profit shares were set in advance. Suppose the venture involves long distance trade. The merchant goes off, trades using the capital. At the end, assuming there are profits, the profits are shared. If disaster strikes along the way and goods are lost, let us say at sea or because a caravan is sacked, the active worker gets nothing for his labor. The passive investor will lose his capital, but he cannot lose anything more. He has, in other words, limited liability. Around the year 1000, essentially the same partnerships were used throughout the Mediterranean. Italians used a limited partnership form known as commenda. It's more or less the same as mudaraba. Around that time, I should repeat, the Middle East was not poorer than Europe, and this is consistent with the fact that Europe did not have superior commercial institutions. This is why, by the way, I have started the story around the year 1000. At that time, the organizational capabilities were not significantly different. The subsequent trajectory, we know, was different. The trajectory of the Middle East and Western Europe was quite different during the second millennium. So something else must have differed around the year 1000 between the Middle East and Western Europe. Of course, I will get to that in a moment. What do we know about the size and longevity of Islamic partnerships? Islamic law put no limit on the number of people contributing labor or capital to a partnership. Nor did Islamic law restrict how long a partnership could last. In principle, 50 people could pool labor and capital for a trading mission expected to last 3 years. However, in practice, the number of partners was usually 2. In the records, we see sometimes 3-person partnerships, 4-person partnerships, rarely partnerships with 5 or more members. And so by the standards of a modern enterprise, these were very small. And the enterprise was typically limited to a single mission, a trade mission, let's say to carry goods from Baghdad to Cairo and back. The hope was that at the end of that, you would split the profits, the mission would be accomplished, the partnership would be over. The pattern that I'm describing endured right up to the 19th century. I don't have figures to show you from the 19th century, but with a team of students, I've constructed a 17th century data set that is relevant. Here is what the size distribution of partnerships looked like in the first half of the 17th century and the second half of the 17th century, the bars in red. Large partnerships, defined as partnerships with 5 or more members, were rare, and this is equally important, there's no trend toward larger sizes during the century. This is the pattern, by the way, that Abdul Majid realizes 2 centuries later, in the mid-19th century, that will keep Ottomans uncompetitive. I should mention that the records that make up the data set are being published now in a 10-volume set that will be about 7,500 pages when complete. The first 2 volumes are out. The data I just showed you come from volume 2 that came out a month ago. Volumes 3 and 4 are coming out next week, and the whole thing will be out by the summer. These volumes contain, in addition to loads of tables, about 6,000 commercial court cases in Ottoman Turkish, modern Turkish, and English. So this is a side project to the book that I just did. Back to Islamic partnerships. At the end of partnerships, partners can, of course, form a new partnership. There's nothing to keep people who pooled resources profitably from setting up a new partnership. But note this, a traditional Islamic partnership is not a corporation. It has no legal standing of its own, and it has no life of its own. It can be dissolved at any time unilaterally. If the member of an Islamic partnership dies, the partnership ends, the assets are liquidated, and the deceased partner's assets are distributed to his heirs. In a modern firm, if an employee dies or a shareholder dies, the enterprise continues. Now, whether an interrupted business activity resumes will depend on whether the assets stay together, or partly depend on whether the assets stay together. And that will depend largely on the inheritance system in place. So let's take a look at the Islamic inheritance system. After the rise of Islam, this was the dominant inheritance system in the region. The Islamic inheritance system, although there are variations, this is common to all of them. It reserves 2/3 of any estate for extended relatives. The female share is always equal to half the male share, so a daughter gets half the share of a son, an aunt gets half the share of an uncle, and so on for each category of relatives. By medieval standards, this was a pretty egalitarian inheritance system. One could not disinherit a child or a relative entitled to a share. All of this has been commented on quite extensively, but there was a downside to this system, and that is what I want to emphasize here because it's most relevant. The system made it difficult to keep property intact from one generation to the next. Successful businesses got fragmented after the founder. Children and other heirs often went off with their shares. In principle, heirs could reconstitute a liquidated business, but there is a catch. The more heirs there are, the higher the cost of reconstituting the business, and therefore the greater the cost of untimely termination. Successful merchants, those with the largest commercial operations, were most likely to have large numbers of heirs. Why? Often they had multiple wives. Because they had multiple wives, they typically had more children. Because they had more children, and also because they were wealthy and they could care for them better, typically they had many more heirs. So the death of a partner was especially problematic if he was a successful businessman. If premature dissolution was costly, members of partnerships would have tried to reduce the risk. And how would they have done this? Well, the risk of premature dissolution rises with partnership size. The larger the partnership, the greater the probability of one partner dying during the contract period. So one thing that merchants are going to do, or we'd expect them to do, merchants and investors, we would expect them to have minimized risk by keeping their partnerships small. The risk of premature dissolution also rises with the anticipated duration of the partnership mission. So merchants and investors would have minimized their risk, the risk of premature dissolution, also by limiting the duration of their partnerships. You'll carry goods from Baghdad to Cairo and back. That will be the end of the partnership. If we're satisfied, if things still look good, we'll form another partnership, rather than forming a partnership for many years to take many trips between Cairo and Baghdad and perhaps other places. So the punchline is that merchants and investors would have formed small and simple and ephemeral companies. The same risk, of course, existed in Western Europe. Medieval Italian partnerships became null and void if a partner died, and I've already told you that the Mudaraba and Commenda are more or less identical, but the inheritance system was different, and that had major consequences over the long run. The Bible does not explicitly specify inheritance rules, so there was vast experimentation in this area. I should have pointed out that the Islamic inheritance system is based on verses of the Quran. So what you find in Europe is that the inheritance system, in great contrast to the Middle East, shows great variation, both across space. You can even in an area as small as Moravia or Lower Saxony, you can see multiple inheritance systems. There were multiple inheritance systems in Switzerland. And you also had variation across time. The inheritance system could be changed. One of the inheritance systems that was used quite widely, or came to be used quite widely in Europe, is of interest here. Under primogeniture, the business falls to the oldest son. In places where primogeniture was practiced, as was typically the northern countries, merchants knew that if one died, his son would take over. They prearranged to have the son step in. This, of course, was not necessarily good for later sons. For the second and third son, they were typically sent to become ministers or to become soldiers. And of course, it was not necessarily good for daughters who were married off. But this system had one great advantage. It reduced the risk of terminating a business early. In other words, it facilitated business continuity over time. Why is this difference between the regions significant for long-term economic development? Why are partnership size and longevity so important historically? Why are they so relevant to the question of why the Middle East fell behind? Advances in the scale and longevity of business enterprises are needed to stimulate the development of more advanced business techniques. Because as enterprises grow, they start facing coordination problems. And when they face coordination problems, they need to find solutions, and they innovate. They start facing communication problems within the organization. Again, they have to innovate. If businesses remain small and short-lived, no need arises for developing advanced forms of business. Just consider accounting. If partnerships are limited to 2 people and they're expected to last 3 months, there's no need for standardized accounting. Accounts are simple. But if partnerships have 10 people at any one time and memberships may change over time, then standardized bookkeeping becomes a necessity. In the West, as business forms evolved, modern accounting developed. In the Middle East, accounting practices did not change before the 19th century, and the reason is that the need did not arise. Likewise, pressures to make shares tradable and to establish stock markets develop only where enterprises become long-lived. People want tradability to make their shares liquid. No stock markets arose in the Middle East until the 19th century, and the basic reason is that people's capital was never tied up for long in firm shares, so they did not need to sell shares. In short, in Europe, institutional innovations fed on themselves, and in the Middle East, commercial institutions stagnated. The persistent smallness of enterprises also limited the division of labor in private commerce and finance. The table on the screen shows distinct occupations in 2 periods in the Arab Middle East. The data come from a book of Maya Schatzmiller of the University of Toronto, and they come from the Arab Middle East. The rest of the Middle East is excluded from this data set. So this refers to all the different different occupations that existed in these two periods, 701 to 1100 and 1101 to 1500, all the different occupations that could be identified through court records and palace records and travel accounts and so on. Economies become more productive through specialization, and that comes from division of labor. Evidently, just looking at the figures up there, there was enormous dynamism in some sectors, in bureaucracy, the military and religion, in education. This is not surprising. This is a period when madrasas, the colleges, are founded, the military adapts to new technology, new empires are formed. This is a sign of creativity in the public sector and in bureaucracy. Commerce, on the other hand, is essentially stagnant, okay? And the lag in the private sector is apparent also in the number of new occupations. Far fewer new occupations emerged in commerce than in the public sector. One consequence of the structural stagnation of the private sector in the Middle East is that it became increasingly, the private sector, sectors of the Middle East became increasingly uncompetitive in global market. Commerce between the Middle East and Europe fell under the control of Westerners. In time, the West was able to industrialize and the Middle East was not. Also, and these, by the way, the economic consequences are developed in the long divergence. There were also some political consequences that I want to touch on. A private sector consisting of atomistic and ephemeral enterprises will not have the political clout of one composed of larger and long-lasting companies. So checks and balances will not arise as easily. A discourse of democracy is less likely to arise if the private sector is atomistic because there are no organized substantial constituencies demanding a share of power. Now, based on my introductory remarks, you might object at this point by reminding me that I said that the state in the Middle East was shallow in the sense that social services were provided by trusts. That suggests, you might point out, that lots of assets were controlled by entities outside the state. Lots of assets were outside of direct control of the state. Were the trusts that controlled a lot of assets, were they atomistic as well? No, the trusts, they were called waqfs, had indefinite lives, and they did control lots of assets. Some of them were quite large, but they themselves had economic drawbacks, and they exerted little political power. So the next thing I want to do is to see why this was the case. In my introduction, I also said that two medieval institutions in the Middle East eventually turned into major handicap. The first was the partnership, and I've discussed why the Islamic partnership turned into handicap and why it didn't generate increasingly complex organizational forms. The second medieval institution that turned into a handicap was the Waqf. So let me now turn to the Waqf and then try to tie the whole thing together. A Waqf is a trust that is founded under Islamic law. It is managed by a trustee who must follow stipulations laid down by the founder. A Waqf is unincorporated. It is not a legal person. It is not self-governing. It is not meant to be self-governing. It relies on an endowment that it uses to provide a designated service, and the arrangement is to last in perpetuity. This type of organization involving assets that are set aside forever to provide a service was the delivery vehicle for functions that were met in the West through corporations. This was the Middle East's alternative to the corporation. Thus, practically all urban services in the Middle East were provided by waqfs and not by municipalities, until, of course, modern times. Colleges, like Al-Azhar, were financed by waqfs. They weren't self-governing the way universities were. So traditionally, a huge variety of services were provided by waqfs. The institution of the waqf permitted individuals to supply in a decentralized manner public goods that are now commonly supplied by governments. And in some respects, this was a magnificent system. Precisely because of its lack of centralized control, it was responsive to local needs. And a huge variety of waqfs providing a vast array of services were built. Practically all the old buildings in the region, with the exception of military buildings, fortresses, and palaces built by sultans, they had some connection to a waqf. Typically, they were founded by waqfs and operated through waqfs. You see an example on the screen as over time, the more and more resources were poured into the waqfs, and a growing share of the real estate in the Middle East came to be controlled by waqfs. Depending on the region, between a quarter and half of all real estate were placed in waqfs. In Anatolia, in the largest part of Turkey, the figure is about a third for this period. So here's a picture from central Istanbul, the old city. All the buildings here, with the exception of one, the one with the modern roof, are buildings that for a long time were supported by waqfs. You see a bathhouse in the foreground, and in the background a college, and in the top left corner there is a mosque. There's another example, caravanserai that was built to house merchants. These are all fortified buildings. You have many of these along the Silk Road. This too was founded as a waqf, and merchants could stay here for a nominal fee until trade on this route dried up. So the waqf was an enormously important institution economically. I should add a footnote here that you shouldn't confuse the traditional waqf with the modern waqf in the Middle East. There are similarities, but there are also some differences. If you want me to go into them, I will in the Q&A period, but I'm talking about the traditional waqf. It so happens that the waqf is not among Islam's original institutions. The earliest evidence of its existence is from about a century after the birth of Islam, the 8th century. What prompted this innovation? Around the 8th and 9th centuries, private property was insecure. Arbitrary taxation and expropriation threatened high officials. These officials did what wealthy people do everywhere. They looked for an institution to serve as a wealth shelter. They used the basic idea of the trust found in earlier civilizations to develop the waqf. By the way, around the time that the waqf was developing, the corporation was gaining importance in Europe. Look at the 7th century, 8th century, 9th century. That's the period when
European in the medieval sense.
In the medieval sense, it's the medieval sense, yeah. European cities, monastery, guilds, and so on were declaring themselves as corporations. Now, the corporate form was not applied to business until the 1600s. as you can see on the right half of the screen. But when the need arose for business corporations, Europe already had centuries of experience with the basic form. So in the Middle Ages, both Europe and the Middle East were highly innovative from an institutional standpoint, but they made choices that contributed over the long run to an economic divergence that left the Middle East behind. Why did assets become more secure when they were endowed as waqfs? What made the waqf a wealth shelter? Regardless of the service it provided, the waqf was considered sacred, and it was common knowledge that this was widely believed. Consequently, rulers were reluctant to expropriate waqf assets lest they develop a reputation for impiety. Of course, there are examples of waqfs that were expropriated, but you're much less likely to see the expropriation of waqf property relative to private property. So property owners endowed waqfs to protect their assets, in other words, to lower the probability of losing property through expropriation or arbitrary taxation. Now, you're probably wondering, if a founder's goal was to shelter assets for his own use, what did he gain by setting up a waqf that would, let us say, provide for the upkeep of an inn or a school? There had to be something in the deal for him. Of course, this was considered a pious act, so he obtained inner satisfaction, he obtained also social prestige, but there were also significant material returns. The founder of a waqf could appoint himself as the trustee of the waqf for life, or he could appoint a friend. As a founder, he enjoyed various benefits, other benefits. He could set his own salary if he appointed himself as a trustee. He could designate his successor. Often he chose a child. The last privilege meant that he could circumvent Islam's inheritance law. He could put property into a waqf and then designate a child as the successor as a trustee to put him in charge of undivided wealth. So in setting up a waqf, a founder didn't simply engage in charity. Some of the secured income accrued to him, to his family, and his descendants. This helps explain the immense popularity of the waqf. But there was a quid pro quo. In return, he accepted certain social responsibilities. Now, why have I taken you through these details? We're trying to understand why traditional economic institutions of the Middle East, the institutions that the Middle East used to pool and preserve capital, did not give rise to modern institutions. The waqfs held massive amounts of property, so any explanation of what went wrong in the Middle East economically or politically must address the role of the waqfs. The waqf has one key property of the corporation. It has an existence apart from its individual trustees, employees, and beneficiaries, so it might have provided the starting point for corporate life. However, unlike a corporation, it is not meant to be self-governing. Legally, its deed is viewed as a contract between the founder and Muslim society. The waqf's objectives and rules of operation are set by the founder, and they cannot be changed. The waqf was a substitute for the corporation, and in relatively static times, it worked reasonably well, so it alleviated the demand for corporate law. The waqf system delayed the emergence of the corporation through one other channel. Because of its wealth sheltering function, it sucked capital out of the commercial sector. Successful merchants invariably set up waqfs to give their families security. In the process, they moved capital into a relatively inflexible sector, from a sector where growing enterprises might have looked for organizational innovations, okay? And they might eventually have looked for ways to incorporate. Due to lack of self-governance, waqfs tended to become economically dysfunctional, especially in times of changing relative prices, changing technologies, and changing opportunities, a waqf set up to provide lodging for merchants could not adjust, at least not quickly, if trade routes changed and the inns were no longer needed. There was also a consequence for political development. Waqfs could not use resources flexibly to support a competitor for political power. Hence, the Waqf sector did not become a source of political checks and balances. In fact, it did not serve the political function that cities organized as corporations or religious orders organized as corporations did in Europe. In any case, their charters precluded them from participating in politics. They could be founded to provide any service that was legitimate under Islamic law. Forming an organized constituency to oppose the ruler was not among them. So let me, in wrapping up, let me go back one last time to the origins and the divergence from the Western organizational pattern. The Waqf in the Middle East and the corporation in the West emerged around the same time. Both solutions, I might point out, grew largely out of Roman law. Why might the solutions have differed? What could have been different in this very innovative period for both regions? During the 8th to 10th centuries, the Middle East had strong states, the Umayyad Empire, the Abbasid Empire, the Fatimid Empire. Western Europe, in the aftermath of the demise of the Western Europe Roman Empire, had weak states unable to enforce law and order. So in the Middle East, an organization emerges to a problem you would see in a society with a strong state, a state that is capable of enforcing a far-reaching legal system, and a state that is also capable of predation. The Waqf provides material security to its founder from a strong state. In the West, an organization emerges at the same time to compensate for weak states and the absence of enforceable law. The corporation supplies the means for self-governance. The trust, by the way, is also borrowed by Europe, but it plays a much smaller role in Western history than it does in the Middle East. I've given you an organizational argument for why the Middle East fell behind. Notice that I have not invoked attitudes towards innovation as an exogenous factor. I haven't suggested that the Middle East is underdeveloped today because Islam is a conservative religion. The region, I would argue, was not opposed to innovation per se. Adaptations did occur. However, and this is critical, during the second millennium, they occurred mostly outside the private economic sector. In this period, government organization went through many changes. The tax system evolved and changed repeatedly, but commerce stagnated. So to recapitulate, I know that some people have to leave at this point. The question has been why, as late as the 19th century, the Middle East had no long-lasting and self-governing private organizations. I identified that as a cause of economic development, as something that set patterns that we observed today. My explanation has had three key components. The Islamic inheritance law, along with Islamic marriage rules, helped keep partnerships small and therefore to limit pressures for organizational innovation. Secondly, Islamic law lacked a concept of the corporation. And thirdly, the substitute for the corporation, the Waqf, sucked capital out of the commercial sector. It was also prone to becoming dysfunctional quickly in times of rapid change. I've added a political consequence to these three consequences that are discussed extensively in the book. The rigidities of the Waqf sector, together with the atomism of the private commercial sector, limited the growth of civil society. So thank you very much. So the first question came from here. Do you want to restate it yourself, or
Oh, you can do it. I already explained to you, so we can have it.
Okay, so I was asked to say something about the capitulations, the commercial privileges given to, you said the French, but they were given also to others. In the case,
first the French from 1520 on.
in the case of the Ottomans, the first commercial privileges were given to the French, and eventually the same privileges were extended to the English and the Dutch, and eventually many others. So the capitulations are generally remembered as a terrible institution for the Middle East because they ultimately led to discrimination in favor of foreign merchants and against local, in this case, Ottoman subjects, the indigenous people. This is certainly the case in the 19th century. In the 19th century, Europeans were exempt from all sorts of taxes that locals had to pay. They had rights to be tried in courts of their own, and at least the local Muslims had to use the Islamic courts and so on. And they can use certain harbors, but that's all in the 19th century. In the beginning, in the 16th century, when the Ottomans extended the first capitulations, or when the Mamluks extended capitulations to the Genoese and Florentines and so on earlier, these were not viewed as instruments of discrimination. They essentially provided foreigners the right to trade securely. This is important. But secondly, and increasingly importantly, they gave foreigners the right to do business under rules of their own. Now, why was this important and why did it become increasingly important? Because the commercial system was evolving in Europe. In the 14th century, it wasn't important to Europeans to pool resources in joint stock companies or corporations because they didn't have any. This was an issue in the 17th century. It was an issue, big issue in the 18th century when you had durable European companies that the English Levant Company is a good example. It had a life of over 200 years. It was doing business in the region, and it wanted to do business under its own rules. If there were disputes among European merchants, the Europeans wanted the disputes to be tried in courts where the judges would understand the commercial culture. And even though foreigners could take their disputes, had the right to take their disputes to local courts, the local courts, because the commercial institutions stagnated, the procedures of the local Islamic courts did not change over time, and it became increasingly disadvantageous if you were using modern organizational forms to have to deal with the Islamic courts. So the capitulations in stages gave Europeans the right to do business under their own rules. So I'll stop there. I think you two were next, so one of you will go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, there's this whole group of scholars like Reshat Kasaba or Çağlar Keder, Faruk Tabak more recently.
Yeah.
And under the influence of Immanuel Wallerstein, they basically say that economic underdevelopment in the Middle East is mostly due to external factors. I mean, Faruk Tabak mentions some internal factors as well in the waning of the Mediterranean, but mostly it's about the emergence of a new type of European capitalism, the post-1815 status quo, the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of new imperialist ideologies.
Yes.
While when I listen to your talk, you are mostly emphasizing internal factors. What do you make of these external factors, and do you position yourself as a critique of this previous school, which used to be quite influential, right?
A critique, and thank you for bringing that up. It's a very important point to identify where these two agendas, where these two arguments differ. I agree with Kedar and Tabak and others who have been working in the footsteps of Manuel Wallerstein, that external factors mattered, that a new form of capitalism developed in the outside world. In fact, one of the reasons I contrast the Middle East with the West and not the Middle East with China or the Middle East with India, which in an earlier period might have made more sense than drawing the contrast with Europe, is that a lot is going on in Europe. So I'm certainly paying attention to external factors. But I would, in addition to what they're saying, I would say that one needs to explain why that same dynamic does not emerge in the Middle East. The dynamic that generated modern capitalism in the West, it didn't emerge in the Middle East. That's a puzzle. It certainly wasn't or isn't obvious looking at the economic institutions a millennium earlier, and it isn't obvious that the region, that the Middle East was on its way to being economically underdeveloped and on its way to being politically subjugated as a result of this, even in the 16th and 17th centuries. Visitors who came to the Middle East who were very critical of Islam as a religion, very critical of lots of things in the Middle East, didn't see the economy as particularly, on the contrary, they see booming commercial centers. Now, of course, in hindsight, we see certain things that were not happening in the Middle East that were happening in Europe that became very important, but we didn't see the differences reflected yet in huge differences in standard of living. Okay? Please.
There are other theses about how economic progress comes about besides lowering transactions costs. One of these is the ability of a society to accept disruptive innovations, as Clayton Christensen characterizes them. So even though corporations potentially have an infinite life, most corporations die rather quickly because the technology that they have brought to the public becomes superseded. So we look at Yahoo struggling in the face of Google, and while the Brin-Page partnership has clothed itself in a corporation, it's essentially these fellows discovering an algorithm and applying it. And I had some experience in Mexico and living in another country, wondered, why Mexico has not had as much technological innovation as the United States. One thing that struck me very much was reading a description of John Coatsworth, the reaction of Mexican residents or Mexican citizens to American pioneers arriving in Texas. And these Americans are putting up mills and fences and whatever they think will improve their property without asking permission. And there are societies where, to do something different, to do something new, you got to get permission first. And I wondered, based on your study, and I know this isn't an area you focused on, but based on your study of Islamic traditions, are there organizations with sufficient clout that if some disruptive innovation comes along and sort of puts them out of business, can they suppress this disruption and stay in business?
With regard to disruptions, one thing I should point out that in Europe, the innovations that I discussed did not arise as a huge disruption. It's not as though over one generation the corporations that take over. They go gradually. The process of legal transformation, institutional transformation takes many centuries. So probably few, there's nothing there, whether it's accounting or stock markets or anything that comes with a huge disruption. The stock markets emerge as little markets, and they grow eventually. By that, given that, the Middle East didn't need for these innovations to occur, the innovations that I've pointed out did not emerge in the Middle East and had to be brought to the region through a transplant in the late 19th century and early 20th century. No disruption really was needed. So if there was an organization that was capable of disrupting, capable of blocking disrupting innovations, that wouldn't explain what I'm after here. Now, having said that, was there an organization capable of blocking innovations? The state certainly was, at certain times, it was capable of blocking innovations. It's not clear that it really cared about the innovations of the type we're looking at in the commercial innovations, that it really cared one way or another. I think something that is more important is that that to the pace of innovation and the attitudes toward innovations and scientific discoveries, and that's that schools were organized differently in the Middle East and the West. Schools, whether we're talking about schools, primary schools, where you learn essentially a little bit of arithmetic and to read, or whether we're talking about colleges, in the Middle East, they are organized as waqfs. And what that means is that typically their curriculum is set, what sort of fields they're going to have teachers in, or the equivalent of professors in. That is set. It's not impossible to change, but you do have to go through the courts to change that. So there is a hurdle there. So these madrasas become ossified over time. This is much less so in the equivalents in Europe, the self-governing universities, which eventually develop new disciplines and become more accommodating towards innovations and new ideas. Go ahead.
I have a question
And then we'll
about
take you, yeah.
what your vision of institutional change is in the book, right? Because at some level, you're suggesting that there's some institutions, at least in the Middle East, that seemed inflexible, right? I mean, there was a lot of innovation going on in political institutions, but institutions with regard to inheritance and whatnot seemed to be cast more in stone. And then those institutions tend to be more subject to innovation in Europe. And I'm wondering, I mean, if we view institutions just as the rule of the games, the parties who play the games will look at it and sometimes say, these are not working for us, so why don't we change it? They're partially endogenous, right? So I'm wondering, what's the idea of why these institutions are so sticky, even though for the players, including the leaders, they can see this is causing us a lot of headache. I'm just curious.
Assuming they recognize that, assuming they see, and when of course in the 19th century they start seeing certain things are causing us big headaches, change comes pretty quickly. Right. Okay, and when you have a law of corporations and you have the courts, you actually have courts that recognize corporations, changes is pretty quickly. So I completely agree with you that institutions are endogenous and they're treated as endogenous. The puzzle is that you have two sets of institutions and you have to start somewhere. Right. So in my case, I start around the year 1000. I look at what the institutions are in one place and what the institutions are in the other place. And then I know from the historical record that in one place they start changing, in the other place they don't. I look for the incentives that people have for either changing the institutions or not. And in the case of Europe, where do those incentives come from? And they come from those coordination problems, communication problems, the initial large enterprises that are set up as late as the the 14th and 15th century, the Medici enterprise headquartered in Florence. It's, they have branches in Bruges, all over Italy, in Paris, various branches. If you look at the organizational structure, they've formed linked partnerships. Essentially, you have the Medicis headquartered in Florence, the Medici family at the center, with partnerships going in all these different directions. Okay, they start facing communication problems, communicating between Bruges and Paris, and going through Florence and so on. So this very primitive organization, later, two centuries later, you see much more, organizations that we would recognize today as precursors to modern organizations. So it's that need that arises when you have the continuity and you have the accumulation of capital that generates the need. In the Middle East, that doesn't emerge. Also, there are incentives there are disincentives to keep resources in commerce, because property rights are not secure, or they're less secure if you maintain your property as private commercial property. There's always a chance that the Sultan will face, in a moment of crisis, will declare a new tax that is designed basically to capture your wealth. You put your resources in the Waqf. That opportunity also prevents the accumulation of capital, and you don't get the innovation. So institutions are being treated as endogenous here. But if you have a persistent equilibrium, and the equilibrium is you have a self-enforcing set of institutions, that's what you have to explain. You were next, yeah.
Your talk and your theory focused on the commercial institutions, and I was wondering if the way the land and agricultural production, if the way the property institutions over land and the way the agricultural production was organized had anything to do with this divergence between Europe and Middle East.
It must have had something to do with it, though it's there. I don't see until relatively late any major differences. And when you come to modern times, institutions that enable you to form larger agricultural plots and certainly help. It allows you to utilize technologies more efficiently. This is not, you don't have that in the Middle East, but I see this as absolutely central. And the reason is that if the private sector, commercial sector had modernized, and if a powerful civil society had developed, there would have been checks and balances on the state, and it was the state in the Middle East that controlled, except for land that was that was in the hands of the Waqf. It was the state that controlled the land, and more of this land I would expect to have moved into the hands of people in the private sector. So, and my reason, another reason for focusing on this is that this is an area that has received very little attention. Okay, but I'm sure there are other mechanisms there that I haven't considered that played a role. Yes.
Thank you first for a very enlightening talk for a non-economist. I'm wondering how the large, powerful, quasi-governmental trading companies, particularly the Dutch, the British East India
Yes.
Company, figure in your scheme. Are they just different by degree, sort of supersized versions of the typical Western company, or is there some special factors that give them a sharper edge against
These companies, remember I put a slide with three types of organizations, basic types of
I
organizations.
think particularly in that they were founded by royal charter or governmental.
Yes, I'll touch on that. So these are not partnerships. They're established as joint stock companies and quickly turn into corporations. And so they have an indefinite existence. It's not possible for a single shareholder to dissolve the company. Now, the state does, and most directly in the case of England, does support them through a charter that gives them, in the case of the East India Company and also in the case of the Levant Company, gives them monopoly rights to trade with a particular region. So in the case of the Levant Company, it provides monopoly rights to trade with the Middle East, between England and the Middle East. That certainly benefits the English merchants vis-a-vis their competitors, the local merchants. So we have to ask why in the Middle East something similar doesn't arise. Why doesn't the Middle East charter groups of merchants, groups of Ottoman merchants or Turkish merchants or Arab merchants who are trading with Britain? The big difference is that in Britain, they're already organized. They've already started pooling resources through within long-lasting organizations, and they essentially make a deal with the English crown. They will be given monopoly rights to trade with a particular region. The same thing happens with the East India Company. What does the crown get in return? Tax payments and regular tax payments. Why doesn't this happen in the Middle East? In the case of the Ottoman Empire, merchants aren't organized in the first place. Why aren't they organized in the first place? They're pretty atomistic. Okay. There was a question here, then we'll take your question. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned you were going to talk about some of the political implications of the talk. Thank you for the talk.
Yeah.
It was exceptionally clear, and I thought it was a lot of food for thought. My question is, in giving this talk obviously I can see where the conclusions you've drawn about these institutions might be highly controversial in certain audiences. Perhaps not. This is not one of those audiences. What are the political implications of what you're saying for economic policy and U.S. policy in the Middle East? And how has this talk been received if you've given it in front of Muslim audiences?
I have given this talk recently. In fact, since the book has emerged, I've spoken several times in Turkey, and it's been quite well received. Now, in each case, the organizer was either an international organization or a local university. Of course, there's some audiences that would not be quite receptive to the argument because they might draw the conclusion that I am saying or arguing that Islam caused underdevelopment. I'm actually saying something quite specific. Certain institutions associated with Islam had unintended consequences, and I would argue that Islam ultimately did not stand in the way of bringing to the Middle East the institutions that did not emerge indigenously. But nonetheless, there are Islamists who have not been along the way as I was writing the book and presenting various components, places, and I've done so in parts of the Arab world as well, also in the Far East, in Malaysia, for example. There have been people who have not accepted the argument, but the discussions have always been, at least in my experience, they've been quite cordial, and it's not unusual for people to disagree with an argument, and certainly when it's making a statement concerning a very long time period in a very large region. There are another group that has had some problems with the argument is what I would call the politicized religious right in the United States, because I do not make the argument that the Middle East became underdeveloped and continues to be poor because Islam is a conservative religion, because Islam does not accommodate change. On the contrary, when I went out of my way in this talk as well and in other publications to point out changes, big changes that did take place in the Middle East. So I don't think that Islam is inherently incompatible with modern capitalism, and I think all of the key institutions for successful economic performance are now present in the Middle East. The key problems in the Middle East now are political and not the lack of economic institutions that are missing.
So,
please, and then we'll come here. Yeah.
You put up clearly the case for some sort of a failure in financial institutions.
Yes.
In the Muslim world. But the financial institution is just one part of the institutional environment. So I would like to hear more about other aspects of this institutional environment, such as the rule of the law, keep maintaining peace.
I'm sorry, the last one I didn't. Rule of law?
Rule of the law.
Yes.
Keeping peace.
Keeping, yeah.
Because I think in this respect, the Ottoman Empire might have compared pretty well with respect to Western Europe in the 18th and the 19th century.
Yeah.
And the comparison has, if you're making an institutional comparison of the Muslim world with respect to Western Europe, it has to be more complete than that. And you have to relate to this sorts of institutional aspects. And second, Professor McCurry is not here, but I would like to ask a question on his behalf. He would say, I would guess, that Western Europe, led by Britain, had prospered over the rest of the world because there was a culture that was conducive of adoption and innovation of technological innovation. At the same time, when the Muslim world was clearly rejecting them, and the late adoption of the printing press is a case in point. So obviously, tendency towards technological innovation or adoption of technologies are not independent of institutional environments, but they are somewhat distinct nevertheless.
Yeah.
And I would also like to hear what you have to say about this sort of explanations. How would the failure of how would you rank the importance of the failure of financial institutions
Yes.
versus the resistance to technological innovation?
I think they're certainly linked. I don't think I quite accept the premise, though, that there was resistance to technological innovation. Now, in the case of the printing press, there wasn't much demand for publishing books. Even when the printing press was accepted, and in 1727 an indigenous printing press was established in Istanbul, for the first 50, 75 years, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, very, very few books were published. There wasn't much of a demand for reading books, and if you need very few books. It's not all that the cost savings from using a printing press are not that great. So there was, yeah. So certainly, by all means, yeah.
Let's just go
Yes.
by order so we got the dialogue.
Textiles as opposed to
Yes,
books.
excuse me. What's that?
The technology for textiles as opposed to books. Everybody wears clothes.
Yes. I mean, I don't know in that particular case. You certainly had a textile industry in the Middle East. And what specific technology are you referring to? In the 19th century?
Just to the progression of technologies.
In that case, the technology, you need the technology. You also need you also need to finance the use of the technology. And the technology certainly did come to the region, but it was brought by minorities and foreigners. And it isn't until the early 20th century that you have indigenous textile companies. So again, they're going back now to this question. The financing is very important. I'm not suggesting that there was no resistance. Certainly, there was some resistance from the ulama who initially said that the printing press, using the printing press to print religious books would defile the religion, and there would be certain drawbacks to printing non-religious books and so on. They've certainly made that argument, but they've made that argument even in the 20th century. We have examples of ulama rejecting technology, and they don't prevail. The television was rejected by Wahhabi ulama in Saudi Arabia, who objected to television on the grounds that it would show images of people. They quickly changed their mind when they discovered what a tremendous tool it could be for them for spreading their own message. And they quickly discovered a hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet that someday man will be able to see another person on the other side of a mountain. And they took this to mean that the Prophet had already blessed the television centuries in advance. There are other examples like this. So I think the fact that we can identify some resistance in society doesn't explain why the society doesn't overcome that resistance. And had there been a huge constituency for the printing press, I think, would have arrived in the Middle East more broadly much earlier. Now, the reason why, of course, that doesn't emerge earlier is because literacy doesn't advance. If you compare Europe and the Middle East, you see that literacy starts climbing much earlier, and of course that supports the spread of the adoption of the printing press. Your other point is your first point is well taken. There are many things that went well for the region. Certainly, in terms of keeping peace, there are certain centuries. You're absolutely right that when the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East in general, they're more at peace. There are fewer conflicts than in Europe. A good friend of mine, Murat İgün, is the expert, and he has all the figures. Why didn't I mention that? Because my goal was to explain, in a sense, not what went right in the region, but explain a particular observation, which is that by the 19th century, the region is an economic laggard. So I tried to identify that, and of course there are other things also that are certainly that worked quite well in the Middle East.
Timur, shall we take one more question? Because we're already a little bit over time, but maybe one more question.
It's really up to you.
We'll do one more formal question, and afterwards we can still do informal Q&A.
So there's a question. Oh, I'm sorry. You were next.
Yeah, I was. Thank you for the lecture.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, to what extent can we judiciously draw the parallel between an institution such as the WAC, which is really, a purely religious institution, and a corporation on the other side, which is purely lucrative. So, can we possibly, have such parallel, and
Yeah.
draw conclusion from that. And the other question would be probably along the same lines. Can we draw a parallel between, for example, 10th century Middle East and 17th century Europe, and
Yeah.
draw conclusion from that parallel?
Okay, so to start with first, the Waqf was actually, even though it was an Islamic institution or became an Islamic institution, it's not in the Quran, by the way. The Waqf becomes an Islamic institution in the 8th century. It is certainly used to support and operate religious organizations that have religious functions, mosques, for example, Quran schools. But the Waqf is not a purely religious organization in terms of its functions. Generally, most Waqfs do not serve religious ends. I showed you an example of a water fountain that was established as a Waqf. That isn't a religious function. It doesn't have to be a religious function. The inns that were established on trade routes, again, they served merchants, and they served not just Muslim merchants, but merchants regardless of faith. If they were part of the caravan, they stayed there. So in the case of the Waqf, the Middle Eastern Waqf, it was not a purely religious institution. Now, what about on the European side? Was the please?
Originally, has not been that way. Originally, maybe it has been extended to other use, but originally it was supposed to be a religious institution, serving that, saying that, well, whoever died and leaves, a sadaqah jariyah, meaning a charity going on charity,
Yes.
would benefit from the.
I think we were probably talking about different things, because a Waqf is not established after you die.
Yeah, but
Although many Waqfs were established during the founder's lifetime. And they weren't established just to provide religious services. And in the case of the corporation, yes, the medieval European corporation was used to serve non-religious functions. Guilds were organized as profit-making guilds were organized as corporations, but the church was organized. Ultimately, the church declared itself a corporation. Religious orders, monasteries were declared themselves corporations. So I think there is a parallel there. In both cases, they support religious functions and also non-religious functions. And with respect to the 10th and 17th century, I start by looking at the institutions in the 10th century in both places, and then I look at the evolution in both places. And in one place you have a transformation. In the other place, at least in this particular context, you don't have the transformation. And so by the 17th century, they look quite different. So I'm not comparing Europe in the 17th century with the Middle East in the 10th century. In the 17th century, you have large commercial profit-making organizations in Europe, and you don't have them in the Middle East. That's the contrast that I'm drawing. The puzzle that I'm trying to explain.
Well, there's a lot more to be asked and talked about, of course. Just want to point out a few things before we stop. There are books in the corner if you're interested in purchasing those. Otherwise, please join me in thanking Professor Kuran. He, by the way, will stick around if you still want to keep an informal conversation going. That would be great. Otherwise, thank you very much.